Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2020 Austin Ivy Plus Virtual Speaker Series hosted here in Zoom and streaming live on YouTube from Austin, Texas. My name is Stephanie Pace. I'm a realtor here in Austin and the president of the Cal Alumni Club of Austin, an affiliate chapter of the Cal Alumni Association at UC Berkeley, and an active social professional networking organization of more than 300 Cal alumni living in Austin, Texas.
And my name is Jennifer Jang. I'm a pharmacist in Austin and vice president of the Cal Alumni Club of Austin. This event not only represents Cal, but also represents the Austin Ivy Plus, a collection of over 1,000 Austin-based alumni from all the Ivy League schools, the Seven Sisters, and several prestigious private and public universities. Tonight, we are highlighting the incredible work of Austin-based superstar, Sarojani Mohammed. Here's a little bit about her mission and background.
Many of us were trained to believe that quantitative research designs allow us to objectively answer questions. After all, numbers don't lie, right? But as Saro progressed in her career, she began to see how even the most complex statistical methods require all sorts of assumptions, especially in the social sciences, that make room for biases to hide and propagate, eventually leading to the three types of lies being lies, damn lies, and statistics. Saro built her career on ensuring data and research are used for the social good by shining a light on bias rather than trying to eliminate it. And she loves sharing with others how they can broaden their definition of rigor and use evidence to fight social injustice rather than facilitate it.
Saro is a graduate of MIT and moved to Austin in 2004 for a PhD in educational psychology, and she now works to ensure research equitably improves learning experiences. She's a founder and principal of Ed Research Works and executive director and founding board member of Capacity Catalyst.
We have one request for our audience. Please mute your audio when our speaker is talking and remain muted until audience Q&A. If audio does become an issue, we will be forced to remove you from tonight's event.
Now we're ready to hear from Saro. Take it away.
Thanks, Stephanie and Jen, and good night, everyone. I'm actually starting this presentation with a pop quiz. It's a mental arithmetic quiz, although you can use calculators if you need to. You shouldn't worry, it's not a trick question. I know everyone's gonna get it right. So imagine there is a school with 3 classrooms. One classroom has 1 student, one classroom has 3 students, and the last classroom has 5 students. The question is, what is the average class size in this school? I'll give you a minute to really try and figure it out. You're not going to have to share your answer. How many of you got 3? Just mentally, you know, I'm seeing some hands. If I had asked teachers or administrators or an observer, an external observer, they would agree with you. The average class size is 3. 1 plus 3 plus 5 divided by 3 classrooms. Did anybody get a different answer? I can't see the chat right now, so maybe people are posting in the chat. Let me see if I can pull it up real quick. There actually is another answer. If we had asked the students in the classrooms, what is your class size? And then we had used their responses, that we'd actually get an answer that was closer to 4. Both of these answers are correct. Neither of them is wrong. The only difference is who you asked for the data. And so the takeaway here is to illustrate that even though we are trained and we are ingrained to think of numbers and quantitative measurements as very fixed and objective and having a right and a wrong answer, in fact, numbers are just as influenced by perspective and experience as qualitative data can be. Before I jump into the real details about data bias and social justice, I just want to tell you a little bit about how I got to here. So my whole life, I've been really interested and sort of curious about the notion of justice, that there is a right and a wrong. And essentially, I've been really wanting to understand the relationship between actions and impacts or consequences. So the math and sort of research part of my brain follows this curiosity into quantitative or experimental research. And the social or more people-driven part of my brain followed this curiosity into psychology or cognition. And as my career as a social scientist progressed, these two perspectives actually began to merge and really turned into, for me, a drive and an objective to use evidence in order to enable a more just world. So the notion that knowledge hoarding is in fact an injustice really drives a lot of my thinking and a lot of the work that I do. So what does that really mean? Knowledge hoarding, data bias, and all of those things. The way that research is done in many of the social sciences today is based on the experimental framework. And I know for many of us who attended some of the Ivies or the Ivy Plus schools, and any of us who really did science, through middle, maybe even into high school, we are well versed with the idea of a hypothesis and hypothesis testing. So the way that we do research in the social sciences, we frame a testable, sometimes it's called a falsifiable hypothesis, and then we measure behaviors and we measure outcomes in order to determine, does a particular behavior cause a particular outcome? And so we rely on something called randomization. We randomly assign people to get a treatment or to participate in an experimental group. And then we randomly assign other people to a control or comparison group. And that process is supposed to eliminate any bias that we're not measuring. And it's supposed to allow us to objectively determine causation as opposed to correlation. So we are able to say whether or not what the treatment or experimental group is doing is causing the outcomes that we're measuring. But to make the math and the statistical modeling work, social scientists actually rely on a ton of assumptions. And I have a list here. I'm going to explain a couple of them, but this is not a complete list by any means. One of the most basic assumptions of the experimental or inferential statistics is that what we are measuring are called independent randomly distributed variables. So the amount of, let's say, reading ability in me is not related to the amount of reading ability in another person in the sample. They're independent, and it's randomly, some of us have a lot, some of us have a little, and it's just randomly distributed throughout the sample. We also believe that the variables that we're measuring follow a sort of normal curve. And so therein lies the idea of like outliers, right? There are people who have a whole lot or a very little of whatever variable we're measuring, but most people sort of sit in the middle. We believe that the outcomes that we are interested in are measurable, they're quantifiable. And we also believe that we can construct, using this randomization process, we can construct a group of people that will tell us what would have happened to our outcomes if we did not have the treatment or the intervention that we are interested in. So the reason that we have a control or comparison group is because we believe that they represent what would have happened with our sample if we didn't do the experiment that we were doing. We also assume that we can create measures that are reliable and valid. So reliability is sort of the consistency of a measure. If I ask you the question today and if I ask you the question tomorrow, will you give me the same answer? Are we measuring really the same thing? And we also believe that they're valid. So validity is more like, is what we think we're measuring what we're actually measuring? And one of the most core assumptions of the randomization or the random experiment design is that what we find, the causal relationship that we find, is generalizable. So we're using a sample to tell us about an underlying relationship that exists out in the world and is actually applicable to everyone or the whole population that we're interested in. So what does that lead to? All of those assumptions work together to lead to inequitable representation in the evidence base itself. Because we rely on randomization primarily to get rid of unmeasured bias, what that ends up doing is it allows bias to creep in in terms of how we choose to build our sample and how we choose to build our measures, like what measures we choose to use. So just one example of this, like it actually is happening. I'm using data from something called the What Works Clearinghouse. And so it's a collection of interventions. It's built and maintained by the federal department, the US Department of Education. And it's meant to provide teachers with guidance about what interventions, so what instructional models work and which ones don't. And the way that evidence gets into the What Works Clearinghouse is by meeting the research that is used as evidence for effectiveness has to meet a series of standards. And randomization is one of them. And so as you can see, I'm comparing here the number of white and Black students that are included in all of the studies of effective interventions in the What Works Clearinghouse. And I'm comparing it to the purple bar, which is the number of white or Black students that are enrolled in public schools nationally. And so as you can see, the What Works Clearinghouse, the studies that meet the standard of rigorous evidence actually overrepresents white students by 7%, and it underrepresents Black students by 6%. So we've essentially built an evidence base of instructional interventions that is biased and does not adequately represent Black students who happen to be underserved and marginalized in education and public education today. And then we use that biased evidence to make data-driven decisions. So if you looked at if you were able to attend or see the recording of the first talk in this series, Selena and Morgan actually specifically talked about their work with the school to prison pipeline. The way that pipeline has sort of become into existence is through the use of discipline data. And as a researcher, as an education researcher, we all know that discipline data are some of the most unreliable data. We don't like to use it in our studies. And we know that there are problems, that there is a lot of subjectivity that is going into discipline data. So what I mean by discipline? It's in schools. One of the things that schools have to keep track of as their administrative data is the number of times that a student is disciplined, as in, did you have to go see the principal or a counselor? Did you get sent to the office? Were you suspended? Did you have an expulsion? And the infractions that different students do in order to get the same types of discipline responses is very different. So Black students, even as young as pre-kindergarten, are more likely to be suspended from preschool for the exact same behaviors that white students don't get suspended for example. So that's one way that we're building this bias database, and then we're using those discipline data to make decisions about whether or not to keep kids in school, whether or not to send students to alternative settings, whether or not to allow them to do certain content areas, especially in high school, and it is directly correlated with their assessment scores. Another really interesting one is the dual discrepancy model. So back when the special education legislation was passed, it's called IDEA, and it's the individuals, I can't believe I just forgot what that, but it was passed in 1974, and it's basically the education law that allows students to receive special education services. We used to determine that eligibility using IQ data and achievement data. So if a student had an average IQ score, but they had a low math score, then we would say, oh, they have a math disability, and so they are eligible for special education services. IQ tests are actually far better at measuring culture and socioeconomic status than they are at measuring underlying intelligence. And so we have created a special education system where minority students and students who are not from the dominant culture are far more overrepresented. English language learning students and others are far more overrepresented in special education than the students who come from the more typical or conventional culture. And I can go on and on. There are problems with the way that we use SAT and GRE scores, which again are highly correlated with SES in order to determine college admissions. And recently, in the early 2000s, when school accountability became national law, we started to use school accountability data, which were really designed to understand the extent to which schools and teachers were serving students. but then we started using them for promotion of students themselves. So whether or not you get to go to fourth grade in Texas or fifth grade in Texas depends on how well you do on the STAR assessment, that's not what the test was developed for. And it's also used to close schools down. And then finally, it leads to real achievement gaps. So those biased data-driven decisions are perpetuating what have been gaps between white students and students of other ethnicities in both math and reading in the US, since, as you can see in this chart, the 1970s. Even though these gaps are decreasing at the rightmost end, so most recently in this chart, they still remain large. So the gaps that you see here today are still between 0.5 and 0.9 of a standard deviation, which is a technical term. So that's about a 20 to 30% gap in scores. And that's a huge oversimplification, so don't count that, don't quote me on that. But that's the type of gap that you're seeing. Like Black students or Hispanic students are scoring 20 to 30% lower in their scores than white students are on basic tests of reading and math. So now that I told you the story of what happens when we use biased data and we collect biased data, now I'm going to turn and tell you what happens when you actually engage communities in the research process. This is just one example. There are others, but I wanted to dig into this one a little bit. So we know from decades of research that the way that you teach reading is by focusing on the big 5 skills. So these 5 skills are phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Phonemic awareness is just the idea and the understanding that letters represent sounds, and when you put those sounds together, they represent words, and words have meaning. So it's just the understanding the relationship between written text and meaning. And that's actually the order in which you teach them. So you may remember how you learn to read. Phonics versus whole language debate notwithstanding, you probably learned your letters first, and then you learned the sounds of those letters, and then you put those letters together and made words. And then you started reading the words. And when you first started, you would read one word, and then the next word, and then the next word. And as you practiced, you would start to read fluently. And then you would start to play with, like, what do these words mean? And then finally, you could read a passage of text and extract meaning from that. So this is the way, the evidence-based way to teach reading. And the way that it played out in public schools usually is through a whole group instruction model where the teacher would model. They would say, this is the letter A goes, the word apple starts with A, apple, right? And then they might ask, can you think of a word that starts with A? And all of the kids are sitting in a group, and some would raise their hands, and then they would call on students one by one and say, yes, Saro, what word do you think of that starts with apple? And I might say ant, or I might say bat, right? And then you would either reinforce if it was positive, you would redirect if it was not the right answer, and then you would move on to the next student. So this form of reading happened in Hawaiian classrooms, just like it happened in classrooms in Florida and classrooms in Alaska and classrooms in Texas and California and all across the country. But Native Hawaiian students, those who were of Hawaiian or Pacific Islander ethnicities, did not do well in learning how to read English, even when English was the primary language that was spoken in their home. And so a couple of Hawaiian researchers decided to ask the question, like, is this because the way of teaching reading to our Hawaiian students does not match their cultural practices? In Hawaii, there is a cultural practice of exchanging information. It's called talk story. And really what it is a small group of people that are just hanging out and talking with each other. And sometimes people would talk over each other. Sometimes one person would finish another's sentence. Sometimes, someone would do that and it actually wasn't the right end to the sentence. So the original speaker would be, no, that's not what I'm trying to say at all. And it was not a problem if people talked over each other. It was not a problem if people didn't finish a complete thought, if it was picked up by someone else in the group. That was just culturally how information is exchanged. And so these researchers said, like, what if we design reading instruction that actually focused on comprehension from the beginning, the way Talk Story does, right? The whole point of communicating in Talk Story is that you're actually exchanging information from the get-go. You're not starting with the idea of, let's say, fluency or vocabulary. And also, what would happen if we sort of started off by invoking background knowledge? So we would, from the very beginning, we would say, this passage is about baseball. Does anybody know anything about baseball? And they would have a couple students tell the story like, oh, I went to a baseball game with my dad, or my brother plays baseball for his school. And so they would get the kids really thinking about the content before they even started teaching reading. And then the way that they would teach it was actually be in small groups, and they would allow choral speech or overlapping speech. They wouldn't ask a question and call on one student. They would just ask a question, and however the group responded, that's how they would respond. Now, after I've given you so much detail, and after we've talked about bias in data and evidence, you are probably expecting the end of this story, which is that, unsurprisingly, this intervention was very effective, and Native students started to progress in their reading development at the same rate as the other students in the classroom. And so this is just one example of how engaging a community in researching themselves can add to and sort of reframe the questions that are being asked and the way that studies are done, and even the outcomes that they're looking for, in order to understand what might be more or less effective in a different culture or if in a different language environment. So for me, the work that I do now, both as a consultant through Ed Research Works and through my nonprofit, is really focused on mobilizing research and this idea of community engagement in research for social justice. So through my consultancy, I help people recognize and combat bias in the research and data work that they are doing. I essentially help them turn research into insight, strategy, and ultimately empowerment for communities that have been marginalized to date. And then on the nonprofit side, there are actually two programs that you can get involved with to help engage marginalized communities more in research and data, especially in studying and understanding themselves. One is an externship, which you can learn more about at this tiny URL. It's called the Community Engaged Research course, and we implemented it, we piloted it last fall at Houston-Tillotson University. And we have students learn about community engaged research, data bias, and also have them work in teams with a local nonprofit to solve a data issue. And then the other one is an externship that we do more with graduate students or early career professionals, where we match them with a nonprofit in order to complete a data project for that nonprofit. So just to give you a little bit more detail on those, you can check out those links or email me. But the mission of my nonprofit is to improve data use in the social sector by connecting capacity with need for a thriving, equitable social data ecosystem. So engaging communities in developing their own data. And in the last 2.5 years, this externship and the course that I just mentioned, we supported 26 externs and students. They have completed 14 data projects that were conducted in 13 nonprofits. And we have been able to work with Houston-Tillotson University, which is Austin's historically Black college and university. It's also the oldest tertiary institution in Austin. And we are hoping to be able to expand the course to repeat it at HT next year during 2021 and expand it to Texas State University, which is a Hispanic serving institution here. And I'll be happy to answer questions about either or both of those programs. But before I do, I'm actually going to have y'all practice some data bias busting. So you are going to have to pretend to be a school administrator for just a little bit. But regardless of your actual role, I think this is really going to help us recognize where some of our own data biases lie. So here's an actual pilot program that took place in a large urban school district near where I live. The underlying question was, is reading tutoring effective at closing achievement gaps? And so they basically said there's a one-to-one reading intervention. We're going to have trained reading tutors, and we're going to match them with our sixth graders who are reading at or below a third grade level. We're going to have these tutors work for 1 hour a week with these students for 1 year, and we're going to do a pre and a post reading assessment, both with the sixth graders that are getting the intervention, so the treatment group, as well as with the sixth graders who are not getting the intervention, so with a comparison group. And so these are the findings. There was a year's growth for both groups in 1 year. The comparison group and the treatment group had the same slope. And the intervention, the tutoring, was actually more resource intensive than in the comparison group. So typical instruction, as you can imagine, because we needed to train a bunch of tutors and they needed to spend an hour a week with each of these sixth graders. And so I'm just going to pose it to the group. Feel free to answer in the chat or verbally, but basically I'm asking you, with this data, did the intervention work? And if you think it did, why? And if you think it didn't, why not? Go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, so I would say that it didn't actually work because like the growth rate was not any better than the comparison group. And I'm also wondering, I think if I interpreted this correctly, the comparison group was not among the target of children that were identified as needing extra support?
That's correct. The target group were just typically progressing sixth graders, yeah.
Right, so, I mean, no. I mean, there's no, I mean, the growth rates are the same, and if the idea is that you want the children who need more help to get to the level of the comparison group, then this is pretty much not worth the time and effort.
Okay. There was one response in the chat that I'm going to read, and then if anyone else wants to share this agreement or a different. So Shirley said, you need to look at different student groups to determine if it works for whom. And she overall thinks that this is an average outcome. Okay, we have another comment from Samaria saying, but what would the growth rate have been for the students who needed the intervention but did not get any? And Jaok, I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, but is commenting that they have different starting points. So I'm going to tell you what the researchers found. It's basically what Allison said. There was no effect, meaning that there was no difference in growth between the comparison group and the treatment group. And basically, the intervention was too costly. It was an extra effect for essentially no effect. An extra expense, sorry, for no effect. But we're going to wonder a little bit, what might the community have said? So if we had asked teachers or students, we would have likely gotten an answer more like what Samaria and Jaok was saying, which is that, in fact, if you look at the 5th grade year for both sets of students, you will see that the struggling students, so the ones who got the intervention, basically the ones who made it to 6th grade, but they could only read at a 3rd grade level, they had been growing at most about half a year's worth of growth in 1 year. So to get from kinder to 6th grade, but only reading at a 3rd grade level, it means that you were only growing half as quickly as a typical student would have grown. But the comparison group was made up of typically growing students. So they were growing 1 year worth of reading growth in 1 year. And so actually what this intervention did was it increased the reading growth of the struggling students. It doubled it. In 1 year, they grew 1 year's worth of reading, whereas every year before that, they only grew half a year's worth of reading. And so basically, for the students and teachers in this intervention, likely they would have felt like the return on the investment was actually a net positive, because yes, it cost more, but you were able to double your struggling students' reading growth in just 1 year. So the decision that was made based on these bias data was that the intervention should not be continued. And actually the district never did this again after this first year. So how does this affect you, right, and your day-to-day? I'm guessing that none of you are social scientists, likely not. You're perhaps not policymakers. You're probably not school administrators, although you might be. But how does this affect you, and what can you do to fight social and racial injustice? There are 3 steps. The first is to recognize that you are actually making data-driven decisions all the time. When you choose what school district you want to live in and what schools you want to send your children to, when you consider whether or not you are going to support wearing a mask during COVID-19 or dining in at a restaurant, when you are voting, all of these are times when you are making data-driven decisions. And so whenever you are using data, the next step that I want you to do is always question those data. You want to know who created these questions, whose data are included, whose voice is missing, and who benefits from the answer that you're given from this data set. And then finally, you can go even a step further and really demand transparency and community engagement whenever you are in a situation where data are being generated or discussed. So when you are among decision makers, you want to speak up and represent the marginalized communities and the communities that are not there, the voices that are missing. And then when you are in marginalized communities, when you are among people who are often excluded from these data, you really want to make sure that you listen and you hear what it is they are saying, that they want to be measured, the questions that they want to ask, and the data that they want to contribute to these data sets. And so I will pass it back to Stephanie and Jennifer.
Thank you, Saro. Your talk was excellent. So tell us, why are you interested in this, and how did you become a champion for social justice?
I think 2 things. One is that I did not grow up in the US. And so when I came here, I all of a sudden became a very successful minority where I wasn't before. So I became a woman in STEM. I'm an MIT graduate. And all of those things were never true when I was actually in high school. And the other thing is, when I did realize, like, oh, I'm all these minorities, it began to occur to me that I'm not where I am today because of anything that I did, or mostly not because of anything that I did. It's actually more because I happened to be born in a place and to people, who were the right ethnicity and they spoke the right language. And so it became apparent to me that the opportunities that I had were very much driven by bias and racial bias in both the US and the society that I grew up in. And so I just felt very strongly that everyone should have the opportunities that I had, because I'm not special, and most people who have those opportunities are actually not special.
What do you think the future of this arena will look like?
So I think it's happening, right? I think data are actually becoming just more and more a part of our social lives through social media, through politics, through pandemics, right? Like more and more data are just becoming an integral part of what we talk about and think about when we want to decide how to act. And so I think it can go one of 2 ways. I'm hoping that it goes the way where we really do start to recognize and question implicit bias in data and push for getting rid of it and sort of, having the conversations talking about the bias in data. But it can also go the other way. We can continue to just sort of be blind to the bias and let ourselves be manipulated, by systems and processes that claim to be unbiased, but in fact are.
So now we're going to open up the talk to live questions from our audience. You can also type your questions in the chat boxes in either Zoom or YouTube Live. Okay, here we go. We actually do have a question submitted from Jennifer K. She lives in San Francisco. She says, I'm not a researcher. How is any of this relevant to my day-to-day?
Yeah. So like I said earlier, you are actually making data-driven decisions all of the time. And so by recognizing, like making a point of stopping and thinking about when you are interacting with data and who those data are coming from and who those data represent and really who stands to gain from those data. One of my favorite actually examples is if any of us are parents, choosing where to live with the school district in mind. So being very intentional about how you choose where you want your kids to go to school. And there's lots of places that you can get data that you use to make those decisions. And I can't think of a single one of those data sources that is not biased. So, it feels like it's not relevant to anyone other than social scientists, but actually it's relevant to all of us.
Jen and I actually have a couple more questions if no one, let me see. We had another question submitted earlier. What's one action I can take to reduce data bias?
I think if you speak up when you are in places where decisions are being made based on data, and you listen when you are in communities where, where marginalized individuals do have the opportunity to express what they're really interested in, that's one really powerful way, because I think those of us on this call actually do have a lot of voice and influence. And so it can be as simple as showing up at your school board meeting and actually listening to who's saying what before you decide who to vote for to serve on your board of trustees, right? Really providing that platform and being quiet and maybe even silencing others sometimes when people with a lack of privilege or people who don't really have the privilege are wanting to speak up can actually be very powerful and give a voice.
The other question was, if bias can hide in numbers, how can we measure anything rigorously without being biased?
Yeah. So it can get overwhelming, right? And I think in a lot of places, researchers actually have a reputation for being like, oh, that was the dumbest study ever because you spent all this money and you did the study. And then at the end, you were like, well, what we found was this, but here are all the limitations, or, the evidence is inconclusive. I think the time that we live in right now, though, really does illustrate how important it is to have a sort of data literate population. So when you're reading the report from the CDC that says like 94% of coronavirus deaths were caused by underlying conditions or other conditions or not COVID, right? And then you have to like really dig into and realize that no, they might have been secondary conditions, but like that person wasn't going to die from diabetes. The only reason they died is because they had diabetes and they got COVID. I think that's where it's on us to sort of recognize the power that we do have and to not allow, voices to talk louder and either say, well, there's no point, like no one can know anything, but also to really make the case that it's actually more rigorous to include community voices and to understand where bias is in your data than less rigorous. And so by advocating for a clearer and a more transparent discussion of where there are biases and, where authors do have something to gain or an agenda from one finding versus another, that's actually being more objective and more quantitative and more evidence-driven than allowing it to just, be invisible and hide.
Sarah, we have a question from Shirley Beckins in the chat box. Can you share an example where community engaged in research has had a positive effect versus the example you shared about the tutoring program? And might there be different points of engagement, thinking primarily about at the beginning and not at the end of the intervention?
Yeah. So I wish I had like a deeper pocket of like, here's this example and this example, but the fact is we don't do this type of research, right? This is not how research is done. But I will say, I can think of probably a couple of public health interventions where, I'm trying to think of like a really specific one, but yes, there are definitely times when you want to engage the community from the very beginning in order to make sure that your definition of success is really what represents success to those communities, and that the questions that you're asking and the measures that you're using are in fact the measures that you want to be using. Okay, so I just thought of one. So I know a usability researcher who actually did a study of the ergonomics of African hair braiding. She's an African-American woman, and she has a very conventional background in usability. So really, normally when she studies ergonomics, it's about sitting in front of a screen, right? Which is how we all think of ergonomics. But for her master's thesis, she decided like she knew so many women who do this work. And actually, she was probably going to be able to help people who do this for a living by understanding. And so she asked them, first of all, what are some of the challenges? What are the ergonomic challenges in the job that they do? And how do they mitigate those? And what she found was that they are actually well aware of, you know, it's a very repetitive motion. And so you end up with repetitive stress injuries. And so hair braiders would do things like they would not schedule the same style back to back. Or you spend a lot of time standing, and a lot of them would actually just purchase mats similar to the mats that you would use at a standing desk because they spend hours of their day standing. But the interesting thing about that one is, so she was using an OSHA approved muscular chart to understand like what specific muscles and motions should she be asking about as her measure. And in fact, as a part of her study, discovered another muscle that is not on the OSHA chart, but that is used in hand braiding and can suffer from repetitive stress injury. So it's this little muscle here that's in the webbing, just by your thumb, and it's because you're actually using your thumb when you're braiding much more than you ever do like with a mouse or at a touch screen. And so that's one example where they actually added to the body of knowledge about like what hand RSIs look like, because they engaged a community that otherwise would have been completely excluded.
Thank you so much for your talk, Saro. This was incredible, and we appreciate you joining us for the series. So just to let you know, everyone, next Thursday we'll have Raja Rajabal as our speaker. He'll be talking about legal immigration to America, the good, the bad, the ugly. And again, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you have a great evening, and we look forward to seeing you next week.